Hello and welcome. I'm Uday Pratap Singh. You're joining us on NewsX Deep Dive. For decades, India was synonymous with one word: population. A young nation, a growing nation, a country whose demographic dividend was seen as its greatest strategic advantage. But today, a major shift is underway. For the first time in modern history, India's fertility rate has fallen below the replacement level. According to the latest sample registration system data, India's total fertility rate has dropped to 1.9 children per woman, below the replacement threshold of 2.1. That is the level generally considered necessary to maintain a stable population over generations. This is not just another statistic, it is a demographic milestone with enormous implications for India's economy, workforce, welfare systems and long-term growth trajectory. It has now triggered a global debate. The question is India's merely following a natural path of development, or is it entering the same demographic trap that has already engulfed China, Japan and much of Europe? India's fertility rate stood at around 2.3 a decade ago. Today it's down to 1.9. That may sound like a small decline, but demographically it is monumental, because once fertility falls below replacement level and remains there for extended periods, the population eventually stops growing and begins to age and decline. The latest data shows that only 6 Indian states now remain above replacement fertility levels: Bihar, Uttar Pradesh, Madhya Pradesh, Rajasthan, Chhattisgarh and Jharkhand. Most of the country is already below the threshold. Delhi has recorded an exceptionally low fertility rate of 1.2, amongst the lowest in the world. In simple terms, Indians are having fewer children than ever before, and this is happening much faster than many experts anticipated. The reasons are familiar: urbanization, higher education levels, greater participation of women in higher education and the workforce, rising housing costs, expensive childcare, changing social aspirations and a growing preference for smaller families. As income rises, families increasingly choose to invest more resources in fewer children rather than having large households. This pattern has been observed across developed and developing economies alike. The irony is striking. Many of the factors policymakers celebrate as signs of development are also the factors driving fertility lower. The more prosperous and educated societies become, the fewer children they tend to have. Few public figures have spoken more frequently about declining birth rates than Elon Musk. Responding to reports on India's fertility decline, Musk noted that India's birth rate has now fallen below replacement levels and argued that the trend is particularly pronounced amongst the most educated sections of society. Musk has repeatedly described population decline as one of the greatest long-term risks facing humanity. His argument is simple: without enough young people, economies struggle to sustain growth, labor shortages emerge, innovation slows, pension systems become strained, and aging societies face increasing fiscal pressure. Whether one agrees with Musk or not, the broader demographic trend he highlights is now visible across continents, and India is no longer immune. Perhaps the biggest warning comes from China. For decades, Beijing worried about overpopulation, and the result was the infamous one-child policy. But today, China's challenge is the exact opposite. Its population has begun shrinking. Births have collapsed. The workforce is contracting. The elderly population is surging. Local governments face mounting pension and healthcare burdens. And despite offering incentives, subsidies and policy changes, Chinese authorities have struggled to persuade families to have more children. The lesson is sobering. Reducing fertility is often easier than increasing it once again. Once social norms shift towards smaller families, reversing the trend becomes extraordinarily difficult. Then there is Japan. For years, Japan has been the global symbol of demographic decline. A shrinking workforce, an aging population, rural communities disappearing, schools closing due to lack of children, entire towns becoming populated largely by retirees. Despite decades of government efforts, Japan has found it extremely difficult to raise birth rates meaningfully. Its economy remains technologically advanced and prosperous, but demographic headwinds continue to constrain long-term growth. Across Europe, similar patterns are emerging. Countries from Italy to Spain, Germany to Poland have grappled with low fertility rates for years. Many are now relying heavily on immigration to offset population decline and labor shortages. India is different from Europe, Japan or China. At least for now, India remains the world's most populous country and still possesses one of the youngest populations amongst major economies. Its workforce will continue growing for some time, and its demographic dividend has not vanished. But the direction of travel has clearly changed. The debate is no longer about population explosion. It is increasingly about population stabilization and eventually, perhaps, population decline. The challenge for policymakers is balancing two realities. On one hand, lower fertility can improve living standards, reduce pressure on resources, and enhance investments in education and health. On the other hand, sustained fertility decline can create future labor shortages, increase dependency ratios, and place enormous pressure on social welfare systems. The key question is not whether India's population will stop growing tomorrow. It will not. The key question is what India looks like 20, 30 or 40 years from now. Will it remain a young nation driving global growth, or will it gradually confront the same aging pressures now visible across much of the developed world? What was once seen as a problem of too many people may eventually become a challenge of too few young people. China is already confronting it. Japan has lived with it for years. Europe continues to struggle with it. And now India has entered the conversation. As Sanjeev Sanyal, economic advisor to the Prime Minister, said, been making this point for the last 2 decades. It is not a crisis yet. There are things that take a long time to build up. However, Indians need to understand that the peak number of live births in India were back in 2001. But for longevity gains, population would have started to decline by the 2030s. Mithali Nikore, economist, is with us live. Mithali, what has led to this change and this statistic now coming out that the birth rate is actually, the fertility rate is actually lower than, of course, the rate of course, that clearly shows, of course, a decline in, of course, births. It clearly shows a decline, of course, in population, demographic. It also shows that we will have much younger population soon if nothing is done to correct it.
No, absolutely, Uday. Thanks a lot for having me on this conversation. I think that, a lot of the discourse around the total fertility rate as the single measure that a lot of analysts are focusing on, I think, first of all, that is a little bit problematic. We don't just have to look at the number of births per woman to understand what is happening in the demographics of a country. We also have to look at how many of those children are surviving. And we look at the infant mortality rates, we look at the maternal mortality rates, and that is what gives us a more complete picture of the demographic status of a country, because there are so many countries in the African continent which have TFRs of 5 or 6, where we still see 5 or 6 average live births per woman, but many of those children, because of malnutrition, don't survive beyond 6 months, 2 years, or even 3 years of age, because of higher rates of healthcare crises that are taking place in these countries. So very honestly, we have to look at some of these net rates. Now, even if one was to take this rate of 1.9, or the fact that Delhi has a rate of 1.2, which is equivalent to some of the Scandinavian countries, again, equivalence of population growth with economic growth and how the countries will do in the longer term, that again I find as an economist quite problematic, and especially when people like Elon Musk make it into such a alarmist thing, because very honestly, Japan has had an aging population for several years, and yet it has continuously posted, even if not very high rates of growth, modest rates of growth with very high standards of living. So again, we have to ask ourselves, in an economy where you have fewer people, as long as those few people have very high standards of living, is that really the outcome which is quite bad? Or is it that we are looking at a future where, with high levels of technology and high standards of living, the people who are in those populations have a higher standard of living and have a better quality of life with probably better environment? So very honestly, I think both the arguments are important. Yes, it is important to keep growing as an economy, it is important to keep growing as a country, and of course we welcome more and more children, but not at the cost, and not at the cost of the health of those children and the health of those mothers. And India has done phenomenally in improving the health of both mother and child, as is evident from the new data that has come from the National Family and Health Survey.
Okay, let me in fact also ask you, of course, with now the fertility rate though going below the replacement rate, do you believe it could have an economic impact as well going forward?
So I think, Uday, here one of the most important debates for India is, what are we doing about half of our productive population, that is women? So for India, today the concern is not just the size of the population, but the quality of the workforce. Because the size of the population will only have an impact if the quality of the workforce does not improve commensurately, and if half of our workforce continues to be denied an entry into the economy. Because you see, it's basic economics and it's basic understanding. Say I have a good idea and you have a good idea, but because I'm a woman, I'm not allowed to be in the workforce because of structural deficiencies in the economy, like the lack of affordable childcare, or the fact that my husband doesn't do equal amount of care work or domestic work in the house, or I can't safely travel to a location where I wanted to do my job. As a result, I lose out on contributing to the economy, and as a result, the economy does not grow. So, very honestly, what I feel really needs to happen today is to attack these structural barriers which hold women back from the workforce, get them into the workforce, and provide them with the support that they need. Why is it that Delhi is sitting at a 1.2, TFR, when countries like the UK, the US are actually higher than Delhi? The US TFR is actually 1.6, and that is a country where childcare is also quite expensive, yet at least it is available and it is there at different levels. So what we need is really huge amount of investment in our care economy. We have estimated at Nicor Associates that the value of the care economy to India could be anywhere between 15 to 17% of GDP.
Okay.
Invested in the care economy can create jobs, create new businesses, and create new value for our economy.
All right, Mithali, thank you for joining us with your perspective on this segment.